Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji zaibo zagyo jinhanya haramita jishoken gon Gai guro esai gu yaku shari ji shiki fui gu gu fui shiki.
Master Yoka cautions, getting rid of things and clinging to emptiness are the same illness. It is like throwing oneself into fire to avoid being drowned. Master Yoka here almost certainly refers to Yoka Daishi, one of the early Chinese patriarchs who was famous for composing a long poem, the Song of Realization on the Way. And here he cautions us, getting rid of things and clinging to emptiness are the same illness. It is like throwing oneself into fire to avoid being drowned. So that getting rid of things. The interesting thing about this is that quite often when we come into a spiritual practice, there is something that I want, and there's certainly some things that I want to get rid of. It could well be that there are certain facets of my personality that I don't like. Perhaps I have a temper, perhaps I have a tendency to over-worry about things. And these are all things that I want to get rid of. The problem is, of course, with that actual wanting, because the Buddha says that that desire itself is the cause of our suffering, if we're familiar with those Four Noble Truths. But despite that, actually this goes a little bit further, because here we're talking getting rid of things. So maybe in the first instance we could consider that getting rid of things to be the things around us. Perhaps we, and this is again quite a classic thing, that we tend to blame objects for our problems. There's an old saying, isn't there, that money is the root of all evil. And really this shows that we have a tendency to blame objects for our own greed in this example. After all, it's not that I walk past the bank and I hear the money saying, "Oh, please, Mr. Bank Robber, please come and liberate me." It doesn't do that. Money is just money. Things are just as they are. They're neither good nor bad. It's the motivation behind them that is the problem, what the intention is behind them. But actually, the truth is that I tend to fetishize objects. And certainly when I want something as well, then the object becomes fetishized. That is, it becomes full of promise. As long as an object that I really want I don't actually have, then the idea of obtaining that object promises me full satisfaction. And we told the story before, but the old example that Venerable Myokyo-ni used to give of the South African who was very slim and well-dressed and came to see her when she was librarian at the Buddhist Society. And there he complained that in London every street seemed to have a patisserie on, and he was rather fond of cream cakes. And he found resisting the temptation very difficult. And so she said, well, if you're willing to try an experiment, next time you walk past a cake shop and you see one, go right up to it and stand in front of it, looking at it, full face on. And there, inside, really feel that I want that cream cake. I want that cream cake. And then she said, close your eyes. And then cut off the cake. And just, I want. And then let the I drop off. So now there's just want, and go into that for about 10 minutes. Really go into that wanting for 10 minutes. Open your eyes and look again and see what there is. She didn't really think he'd do it, but half an hour later he came rushing back and saying, it worked. And she said, what happened? She said, well, I did as you said. I opened my eyes, I looked. It was just a cream cake. There was no temptation. There was no I must have. There was no feeling that it was sort of winking at me and calling me. I'm cured. And she said, no, you're not. But now at least you do know how to deal with it when those things come again. And these things pop up, these things are happening to us all the time, with people, with situations, with things. These are the things that I want and things that I don't want. And this is why we end up avoiding certain situations, certain people, because we're actually frightened about the reaction that it will provoke in our own heart. But we tend to project that reaction out onto others. That is, we tend to blame objects and situations for my own reaction. And so this reminds us once again what the orientation of Buddhism is, that Buddhism is not about rearranging the world according to my desires. The world has got billions of people in it. Imagine if we all tried to do that. Well, in fact, we do all try and do that. And if you look into our news, you can see that we're falling over each other in order to do that, usually by some kind of force or manipulation, and it creates a hell of a problem for us all, and real suffering, and always has. And this is why the orientation of Buddhism has always been to sort out one's own heart first. So, getting rid of things. If we go back, actually, even to the story of the Buddha, if we remember after he had left the two teachers, having set out upon his spiritual path. This was before he sat down under the Bodhi tree. And then he went into the forest and undertook the very severe ascetic practices. And so austere and so disciplined he was in this, and good at it too, that 5 like-minded ascetics grouped around him and looked up to him as their guru. And after a period when the ascetic Gautama realized that this path too was fruitless and would not answer the question of what is the cause of human suffering, he renounced that path too. And he did this by taking a drink of milk gruel and then washing in the river, 2 things ascetics are not supposed to do at all. And when those 5 ascetics saw this, they became furious. They really became upset. And they talked amongst themselves, saying, "Look at the ascetic Gautama, guzzling milk gruel, washing in the river. He has taken to a life of luxury." And they turned their back on him and wouldn't speak to him. It would be different if they said, but why have you done this? Which would just be an honest inquiry, an honest admission that I don't understand why you've done this. But they didn't. They judged him. And in that judgment we see the spiritual pride that was there. Yes, those ascetics had removed from themselves the food, the luxury, had removed from themselves all those things that we take for granted that we want, obviously, for our own comfort. But the wanting for them hadn't gone, and this is why they were so upset, because having declared war on it in themselves, when they see it displayed in another, then it's unforgivable. As Shakespeare puts it in Hamlet, in the case of the play within the play, the lady she doth protest too much, methinks. So these are the ways that we really do sort of project out onto that, and this is why Buddhism is interested in what's going on in our own heart. We have to, as Myokyo-ni said, the cream cake has to go, and we're left with just that I wanting. And when that I falls off, then we are just left with the wanting too. But getting rid of things is one side. Then, if I do fall into that getting rid of things, and I think that somehow this is the emptiness. Well, actually, Master Yoka says this is the same illness. We can end up clinging to that too. And of course, emptiness was a teaching that was formulated originally by the great Indian sage of the 2nd century, Nagarjuna, who founded the Madhyamaka school of Indian Mahayana Buddhism. Very famous, and the ideas that were formulated there obviously influenced the Mahayana schools of today, even though Nagarjuna's school itself no longer exists. But we can even cling to emptiness. And Nagarjuna, it's interesting because Nagarjuna used emptiness, otherwise known as shunyata. If someone came up to him and would assert a view about something, usually some kind of philosophical view, then he would take it apart. He would reveal the inherent contradiction in it and would alleviate the enquirer of that view. And if the enquirer then adopted the opposite view, he would do the same thing again. So if someone came up and said shunyata is nothing, then he would say it's something. And if someone said, oh, well, in that case, shunyata is something, then he would say, no, it's nothing. And in that way, whatever was asserted would be taken away. Whatever was asserted would be taken away. That is shunyata. Any form of conception whatsoever, even of shunyata, is taken away. And of course, we see this translated into the Zen school, of course. This goes all the way through. Master Basso, for example, who for many years taught heart is Buddha. That's how he came to his insights, because his master said to him, heart is Buddha. And he brought many of his own students to insight, to enlightenment by that phrase, heart is Buddha. But when everybody began clinging to that, then one day he stood up and at his sermon, when everybody was waiting to hear heart is Buddha, he declared neither heart nor Buddha. And that really set the cat amongst the pigeons. Same with Master Joshu. A monk came up to him and said, does a dog have Buddha nature? And he replied, mo, meaning no. But at another time, another monk comes up, does a dog have Buddha nature? Yes. Oh, he said. Well, does Joshu know? Does he not know? What is he playing at? The truth is not contained in the words. It's always the removing of the obstacles, just that removing of the obstacles. So even emptiness I can cling to, and a little bit this can be a phase in our training too, when the sense of austerities can sort of hit us and we think, now, right, there must be that discipline, and it becomes very rigorous, and it can become a little bit too much, and a little bit too much self-denying, and a little bit too much more self-denying. I remember there was a story of, I think it was the Venerable Sumedho told, of one of the Theravadan monks. I don't think it was him, but it was someone else whom he knew, a Westerner, who used to smoke. And he decided that really if he was going to be a monk, he should give up smoking. So he told his teacher about it. And the teacher said, okay, you give it up, but 1 cigarette a day you keep. It might sound odd, should a monk do that? What's the principle here? But it's not about the principle, it's about applying the medicine, because the Buddha's teachings are a medicine. That's why the Buddha was called the great physician. And what is that medicine? It's to not allow that one-sidedness to come. And a little bit with that giving up of smoking and doing this and doing that, it can become a little bit holier and holier and holier and holier. And if it goes like that, then there's always the threat of spiritual pride, which is a great danger, and that's talked about much in all spiritual traditions. So that clinging to emptiness and that getting rid of things, all part of that same illness. And as Master Yoka puts it, rather nicely, it's like throwing oneself into fire to avoid being drowned. Of course, both of these things, what he's saying, of course, is that both of these things lead to death and injury and suffering. Why? Because they're karma producing. They're both based on my intention either to have my own way and to please myself, or my intention to be holier and holier and holier, and self-denying, and so on. And both of these the Buddha rejected. That is why the Buddha taught the middle way. Fundamentally, that shunyata is not a concept. It is not a practice in the sense of, it's not a practice. It's what happens when there is simply nothing left to cling to with that. And we have to be careful also, because in the teachings too, we can get very one-sided about it. A classic example, and it shows again actually in the teachings of the sixth patriarch, Eino Daiken. If we remember those 2 verses that feature in the story, firstly the verse written by the head monk, this very body is the Bodhi tree, and the heart is a bright mirror on a stand. Carefully wipe that mirror so that no dust may alight. And of course, this is our classic formula for daily life practice. Here's the body, here's the heart, whenever it becomes covered with my fancies, my thoughts, whenever I get carried away, for example, to immediately let go as soon as the awareness comes into it, as soon as possible come back and give myself wholeheartedly back into what at this moment is being done. And when the fifth patriarch saw this, he realized, first of all, that his head monk had not penetrated through into the great matter of life and death, but he said to the rest of the monks there, if you learn this off by heart and most importantly practice it, then your liberation is assured. And he would not have said that if it were not true, and that's important. But when the sixth patriarch wrote his verse, there is no Bodhi tree. The bright mirror has no stand. When there is absolutely nothing whatsoever, what dust can a light wear? The fifth patriarch immediately knew that this one had penetrated through, but he took his shoe off and rubbed it out, because the monks were not ready for this, not just yet. And interestingly, in his Platform Sutra, towards the end, there's a chapter on advice for his senior monks who are going to be teaching others. And he says in that, he says, if anyone comes to you and asks about light, answer them in terms of darkness. And in this way, the opposites are always seen as being conjoined. Rather in that same way, if we think about that Chinese yin-yang, the black fish with the white eye and the white fish with the black eye, they are never apart, they're always conjoined, always together, because they're mutually interdependent. And so it is with all the opposites. Emptiness is not even above and beyond. It's because it's part of it. It's within it. It's without it. It can't really say where it is. It's the nature of it. Because that's what shunyata is. It's that true nature of things. So there we go. Our advice from Master Yoka, not just blindly getting rid of things. But that's not to say that we don't practice restraint. We do practice restraint. We operate within the precepts. But what we do is we really see into the nature of things. And seeing into the true nature of things, in that moment we're released from it. Rather like in Zazen, for example. I can be carried away by thoughts, or there can be a moment, a flash of insight, when suddenly we see that for the past 5 minutes I've been preoccupied with my daydreaming. That moment is a moment of liberation, because that moment is free of thinking. That moment is free of I. So rather than getting upset about the fact that for the 10,000th time I've been carried away, we should be rejoicing that once again we've had a moment of clarity, a moment of liberation. And by continuing with our practice, and that includes a practice of moderate and proper restraint, then we are firmly our footsteps on the Buddha's path, that wiping the mirror, please, which, as the fifth patriarch assures us, will lead to that point when suddenly there is that complete dropping off. And then, as Master Torre says, then begins a different life. Okay, we'll leave it there.
Yate haraso yate boji soaka anya shin